Hey everybody, this is Mr. Munson. You may or may not have gotten this real-world angle of elevation depression worksheet slash study guide. If you have, then I have some helpful hints for each one of the problems, maybe even a setup or two. So I'm just going to kind of take a few moments to walk through each problem. You're not going to hear me talking very much if I talk at all, okay? So if you don't hear me, it's not because the audio is not working. It's simply just because I'm going to have you think through the problem with what the information I've given you. All right, let's go ahead and get started. Okay, first things first, let's just kind of do a real quick review. We have basically four concepts that we're going to have to make sure we understand here. Concept number one, which is 7.1, of course, we looked at the Pythagorean theorem, Pythagorean converse, and reducing radicals. Now, in more detail, I had a reducing radicals video that I invited you to go and take a look at. If you're struggling with reducing radicals, go take a look at that. Next up was concept number 2, or 7.2, and we had two special triangles we had to memorize to be used as similar triangles depending on the problem. If the problem, we could deduce that the triangle that we were working with was either a 30-60-90 or a 45-45-90, then we brought in these special triangles to help us write proportions so that, and that was basically coming from Unit 6, basically, that we had given a triangle that had a 30-60-90 in it, and then this reference triangle brought into it. The two triangles were similar because they had two angles that were congruent to each other by angle-angle similarity. The two triangles we're talking about would be similar, and that allowed us to start writing proportions between the sides. So again, any one of these concepts sound confusing to you, you should go back and watch the video again. So concept number 3, 7.3, was trig equations and functions. So we had those basic trig functions, and we came up with, or I showed you kind of a thing to help you remember the trig functions. Native American, in my case, a Native American girl that I showed you by the name of Sokotoa. And so those are typically the equations we'd use if we were given an angle and a side, and we wanted to go find another side. That would have been the equations that we'd use. Now we use the inverse trig functions when we were looking for an angle. So suppose I gave you two angles or even three angles and asked you to find another two or three sides, and then I would ask you to find an angle. So you'd set up one of the trig equations that I just showed you, the sine, cosine, tangent, but we would apply sine inverse, cosine inverse, tangent inverse, whichever one was appropriate, to strip away the trig function that was being applied to the angle to allow us to see what the angle really was. So if you remember, we might have done something like this, where we were trying to solve for an angle in this triangle that we have a 3 and a 4. And you know, if I had given you the third side, I could use any one of my trig functions to solve for that unknown angle, right? Because I have all three sides. So I could use tangent, sine, cosine, doesn't matter. In this case, I didn't know what that 5 was. So looking at the pieces, this angle and the pieces that are here and relative to it, I see that's an opposite and adjacent side. So that's a tangent function. So tangent of theta is equal to 3 over 4. Simply apply the inverse tangent to both sides, and I find out tangent inverse equals 3 over 4, and then at that point I just type that in my calculator and find out what the angle is. And then lastly, we have the concept number 4. Basically, we're looking at the angle of elevation and depression. Okay, so the angle of depression is the angle formed by, let's say, a balloonist looking straight out and has to look down at the people down on the ground. When they looks down, going from looking straight out down is creating an angle of depression. The person standing on the ground looking straight ahead looks up to the balloon. That creates an angle of elevation. And of course, these two things are congruent because they're alternate interior angles given on two parallel lines. Horizontal lines are parallel, and so there you have it. So let's take a look at some of the problems. Once again, you probably won't hear too much talking from me. You might see some casual writing every once in a while as I add information. But from this point on, you're pretty much not going to hear me talking.